You're sweet on comparison tests, sure you are. Nissan Z and Toyota Supra. We're gonna get these bad boys out on track on the same tire, Bridgestone RE71 RS. We're gonna get it in the shop, talk about the mechanical stuff. We're gonna throw it on an engine dyno. It's gonna be spectacular. The only thing you have to do is sit there and watch. You want real JDM? You got it. The Nissan Z. This is much like the previous generation, just smoothed out and updated. Now what else you get is a more basic approach. Everything is physical, everything is intuitive, and it is very familiar to the 370, so there's not going to be this learning curve. Compared to the Supra, there are some pros. The visibility is way better. When I get in this thing, I don't rearrange my brain because I don't hit my head on the upper sill every time. It feels much more roomy. Now, while the hatch or the cargo space in the back may have less cubic footage, it is far more usable because the width of the hatch allows me to put real items like my suitcase when I leave my family or other things from the grocery store. The interior space overall is classic Nissan. Now, the things that you do want to know is the audio system is very average. I would say they're on par, and we'll put up the graphs. The seats are more suited for a smaller, petite body type like myself. If you're full of 150 pounds of pure brute muscle, you're probably going to prefer the Supra. The last thing to talk about is storage, and the Z does a better job because the door panels are more usable. You can fit a bottle in there. Again, there just feels like there's more space on the inside of this, even though the numbers may not suggest it. Let's head over to the Supra. Oh, Supra. That's right. You know it already. It's got a BMW interior. Compared to the Nissan Z, this feels like you're sitting in a very deep, dark hole. That's because there's minimal visibility. There's no glass for the front windshield. The dashboard's tight. You just feel claustrophobic in here. If you're a bigger person, you're gonna be in for a real surprise. This is hard to get adjusted to. If you have your seat up high, you're gonna hit your head quite often. So it's one of those, you gotta warn your passengers, you gotta snake in here. And that's the overall feeling of the interior space. But the pros are, this generation of BMW design leaves all physical controls. It feels purpose-built to be a sports car. There is no infuriating stuff. There's no figuring out where things are at. Everything is right at your fingertips. From your HVAC controls, having this clicky feel to them, ease of use, having shortcut buttons to turn off the screen. Everything in here is great as a driving tool. Now, in terms of some of the negatives, because of the compromised space, you don't have great ergonomics in some areas, you don't have good storage capacity, and you see it in the doors, and like we talked about in the Z, the trunk space. While it's deeper, you can't fit normal-sized things in the back. So again, there's these compromises. You are buying a two-seat sports car, so where you lose it here is in a lot of the interior dimensions. But I think it's time to head into the shop to look at the mechanical attributes of both these cars briefly.
In the shop with the all-new Nissan Z and Toyota Supra. And in this video, or at least this portion of the video, we're gonna do our best to walk you through the pros and cons of both of these vehicles, as we have already done extremely comprehensive videos on both of these cars.
Yeah, and we're not gonna retread all of that information, we're just gonna give you the highlights. So,
I want to also bring this up. To be clear, in the track portion of this video, both of these cars are now on the identical tire. They are on the all-new RE71 RS, which were supplied by Bridgestone. And to be clear, both of these cars do not come on these tires as standard. The Z comes on a Bridgestone S007, which is more of a
high performance
touring
summer,
tire, yeah.
Touring, yeah, and we've tested on other cars and it's not the stickiest tire,
Nope.
But it is quiet.
Yes, it is. And this car, the Supra that we're underneath right now, comes on Pilot Super Sports, not the Pilot 4S.
So the RE71 RS, as you're going to see pretty quickly, is one of the fastest tires for time trial, or is going to be one of the fastest tires in time trial autocross. It's just short of an R compound, right? So it essentially is a .R compound. It's a total cheater tire, and it's going to be one of the stickiest tires you're going to buy that you're going to drive on the street. So we're going to get to experience best case scenario driving these. But Jack, I work 7 days a week. Okay, I don't have time to get up at 7 in the morning or drop a car off in the middle of the day. What are my options for working on these?
Well, there are some gentlemen in Downers Grove, Illinois that run a shop called AFA Performance, and they were kind enough, because they work odd hours, they are open past 5 p.m., that they decided, and they were kind enough to mount the tires for both of these cars, and they did the pads and fluid on the Nissan Z. So the Supra is on the stock pads and fluid as the car leaves the factory, and the Z has their factory or dealer optioned Nismo pads with some modal brake fluid.
And we did that because the stock braking system on the Supra is a little bit more robust, even though the pad material is not the greatest. It's not going to hold up an extended period of time. But we wanted to neutralize that, so when we went out on the track and when Britt Casey sets fast laps, we didn't want to have like this massive fade issue where, you know, one was falling off and the other one had an advantage. So they're pretty equal for at least that 3 or 4 laps that we're going to run it at a time.
So Mark, let's talk about the Supra first, because that's what we're underneath. So when compared to the Z, it has better weight distribution. It is nearly 150 pounds lighter, and that is comparing this automatic to the manual Z. That weight distribution, or that weight difference between the two vehicles, will grow when you have a automatic equipped Z. The Supra, as of today, when we're shooting this video, only comes with an automatic. It is a ZF 8-speed. It is vastly superior to what's found in the Nissan, which is a 9-speed Jatco unit. This rev match downshifts faster, it shifts up faster, it is much better programming. However, in the near future, probably in the next month or so, we will be driving the manual equipped Supra, and that manual is not built by Toyota. It is a BMW gearbox. It's a ZF.
And it's straight out of the M240i.
Yep.
And Toyota will tell you that it was bespoke to the Supra.
And badass, but
yeah,
it is not.
It is not. It is just another BMW carryover part that they've had to make some modifications, I believe, to fit it to the car.
Yeah.
Just based on the design of it.
And there are small suspension changes between both of these, between the manual Supra and the later model years and the one we're underneath right now.
But for this video, it's not going to matter. We're running the traditional automatic versus the Z manual.
So let's talk about the platform this is on. This is on the sports car variation of Clar. It is a BMW platform. It is strut front, multi-link rear. The front has all aluminum suspension components. The rear has steel. And if you look at the aero properties and the overall body rigidity of both cars, the Supra, because it's on a more modern platform, is far more rigid, and everything's covered up, which means it should be more aero-stable.
Yeah, this car is going to have a lot higher overhead, and I think we're going to talk about that during the drive. You're starting with a newer, better foundation here in many ways. Like you said, aluminum front subframe. I mean, all you have to do is look at this for about 2 minutes and realize, okay, if I want to go to the extreme, this is probably the better starting point. However, there are some things about this car that are not completely sorted out and will always have deficiencies, namely
Strut
in
front.
this. Even though it has, dual ball joint, offset ball joints in the lower half.
Like an M car.
Like an M car, it's still strut. And you're going to feel that instantly no matter what you do. So again, it's like, what do you value?
This car versus the Z, though, has adaptive dampers. And there's a relatively big difference between normal and sport. And then the rear, just like the Z, it is a clutch-based rear differential. However, this is basically an M-style diff, so it has very BMW-like locking characteristics in the rear, which for me is fun, but at the same time, not necessarily the most natural.
And it's looking at steering wheel angle sensors and throttle position to know, like, hey, if you reach a certain point at a certain speed, it will just instantly lock because it knows you want to break the back end loose. So there's smart things about it. And from a technology perspective, clearly this car just, I think there was more money to start that they just trickled down into a lower price.
People gave this car a really hard time for being basically a BMW. The pro of having that BMW development money combined with Toyota's is they could build a far more expensive car without having it cost a ton of money.
$80,000.
This is a $55,000-ish car. So let's get underneath the Z, Mark.
All right. Well, now we're under the brand new Z. There's bugs in this shop. I hope it's not because this thing's a piece of shit. Tell me about it. We've already done the world's longest video on this car, so what else is there to know?
Well, not a whole lot. So if you want to learn everything there is to learn about the all-new Nissan Z, watch our documentary-style video on this car. We talk to designers and engineers and all those other fun people. So we'll give you the crash course on this vehicle. It's still on the Z34 platform. However, 80% of the parts are either revised or all new. Obviously, all the exterior body panels are different. They have made this vehicle about 20% more rigid overall. They focus on reducing NVH and increasing overall rigidity of the chassis to make this car feel more direct. It still has an aluminum front subframe. It has revised suspension components, so it's monotube dampers. It has stiffer springs and dampers. It has stiffer bushings and stiffer sway bars to deal with the extra power and extra torque, and not to mention extra weight. If you go with a car like this with a performance pack, you get larger brakes in the front as standard, and you get a clutch-based style LSD in the rear versus the former viscous style diff, which was terrible.
What about the trim levels? Why isn't there a middle trim level that's more affordable?
Well, this car is going to be around for a couple years, and I'm sure in a couple years there's going to be a Sport Plus trim that just has an LSD. This car, as tested, however, is around $51,000.
That's the fine print right now,
Yes.
right? You only have that. They will fix it.
When you look at this vehicle, though, Mark, comparing it to the Supra, obviously it's nowhere as covered up, and that's the con, I guess, of having Nissan solely develop this vehicle. They did not have a huge development budget, so this looks like an old car underneath. Does not have all of the complex body adhesives and aero panels that the Supra has, and clearly when you drive this car, the chassis is nowhere as rigid. However, it does have one big pro dynamically over the Supra, and that is it is double wishbone.
Yes, of course. And because of that, it feels way better on the front end, and you're going to be able to do far more with the aftermarket to make this thing just load up and grip to your heart's content. They did make some major modifications to the front half of this car for cooling because this engine makes far more horsepower than the previous generation car, which is a welcome change. They made some changes also to the manual transmission, as we talked about in the previous video, and the automatic transmission is completely different.
Yes, if you get the manual or automatic, you get a oil cooler, and it's in the giant opening in the front of this vehicle. And if you get the automatic, you get an automatic trans cooler as well. But as we're about to talk about in the drive segment later, the automatic is...
I don't care about that. Tell me about the engine.
Well, instead of me telling you about the engine because I don't know anything, let's go to AMS, where we're going to put both of these cars on the dyno and talk to some people who actually, well, design parts for these vehicles.
They make a living designing parts for
Yes,
these vehicles.
they do. I'm here at AMS, where we just dynoed both vehicles, and I'm here with their tuner, Miles. And, well, AMS is quite the premium performance shop. They build factory parts for Nissan for their performance catalog for Infiniti. They have tuned GTRs, Audis, and the Supra, so they are very familiar with both of these power plants. So what kind of power do these motors make?
Today we have the B58 in the Supra making right at 400 wheel horsepower, and the new Nissan Z, which I'm sure everybody's excited to hear and see on the dyno, made 375 wheel horsepower of the wheels.
And that's with a manual, and this Supra has an automatic.
Yep.
The Supra made 421 foot-pounds of torque, where the Z made, what, 360-ish?
About 360. So we're talking about 60 more foot-pound of torque in the B58 Supra than the Z.
So if you're wondering why the Z is slower than the Supra in a straight line, the Supra weighs less, it's 150 pounds lighter, and it makes 30 more horsepower and 60 foot-pounds of torque more. But I guess one of the questions I have for you, both of these motors are obviously different. The VR30 in the Z is an open deck twin turbo V6, where the B58 is an inline six closed deck single turbo.
Yep.
How tunable are each one of these motors?
Very potent when it comes to modifications and tuning. Even just tuning alone is a huge bump. Obviously, since they're both turbocharged, there's tons of room left on the table. As far as maximal potential, I mean, out of the box, like stock turbo Supra versus stock turbo VR30 powered Qs, as we've seen, they're easily over 400 horsepower, 425 horsepower in pump gas all day long, 450 wheel horsepower, these in pump gas all day long. Maximum power potential, I mean, the Supras just kind of almost blow the VR30 out of the water. You can probably do 600, 700 wheel horsepower, and the B58's not sweating at all. The VR30 on the other hand is like 500 wheel horsepower, it'll do that on 85 stock turbo, but once you start upgrading the turbo on the VR30, I think anything over 6, you're kind of gambling.
All right, Jack, you got me real hot and bothered with this automatic Z on the street. Let's see how she gets off the line. This thing sounds, why does this sound so much better?
Well, Mark, the automatic gets a valved exhaust, and that's because Nissan knows all the Z boys who buy the manual variant are going to put the stock exhaust with the manual in the garbage can or take a screwdriver to it, and they're going to be unbelievably loud.
Well, so let's just get that out of the way. The big pro of the automatic is the exhaust sounds way better. There's a lot more ambience in here from the engine or exhaust note. Where do you want to start? You want to start with the engine and transmission, or what?
Yeah, we're going to briefly cover the automatic gearbox specifically, as you put on my heated seat, you piece of shit.
You're welcome.
It's like, why's my ass sweating?
It's because you're so intense
Oh
driving
man,
this.
I put this in the manual, and I put this in the D mode.
Oh,
which
it's got a D mode?
It's got a D mode.
What's that stand for?
Disappointment, because this gearbox, this automatic gearbox is not very good. Let me demonstrate. It upshifts all right, and then I'm going to get into the downshifts. It reminds me of the older Lexus
converted,
gearbox.
yeah.
Sometimes it doesn't rev match downshift, sometimes it does. When you put it into regular drive, it doesn't really always know when to downshift or when to accelerate. It just feels kind of dim-witted. And to be fair to this gearbox, it's their Mercedes Jatco 9-speed automatic that's used in a variety of applications. It wasn't a bespoke sports car gearbox. And if you are just putting around in this car, it's fine. I mean, and I'm sure it's I know it's faster in a straight line, and apparently it does return better lap times, but it's not better to drive, and that's the important part about it.
Okay, so there's two parts to that, and I'm going to counter it, although I agree with you. This, to me, is the car for somebody that just doesn't care about, ultimate performance, is looking for a street car. They are sitting in traffic.
You mean the automatic?
The automatic, yes. And I think it does a good enough job for that. If you are a complete enthusiast, there's no way you're gonna choose this. You still can have fun in it, so you can't really say in a bubble that it's bad until you get into the Supra. When you get into the ZF 8-speed out of the BMW, there's just no comparison, and I'm just gonna leave it at that.
So what about these cars as street vehicles? Because that's this portion of the drive before we hit Autobahn Country Club. Britt Casey will then lap these cars flat out on fresh tires, and then we're going to drive them and talk about what's actually better to drive on the track. But how are these cars as street cars?
Well, let's talk about the stock tires and suspension. The stock tires
on the Z.
On the Z are pure comedy,
yes,
because it's much like the premises that they put on the 86 eons ago. It was designed to be there to allow you to explore the limits of the car at low speeds, and that's what I feel like this does. You can always go sideways, you can always break the rear loose, you can do burnouts, you can do all that stuff in it. So in that case, it's really fun on the street. Again, until you go to the next level, you want to drive 8 or 9 tenths, all you're doing is sliding around.
You have understeer in the front, you have oversteer in the rear. They don't have a lot of grip. They're definitely meant to be quieter.
Yes. So suspension tuning. It's strange because the new dampers, they feel very firm when you're on the street. You feel like, oh, this is a really responsive, sporty car, until you load it up. And then you feel like once you get to that longer travel, when you really load up the body, that's where they feel soft. But the initial little micro jitters and bumps and all the little tiny stuff, it's definitely on the firmer side. They are not adaptive, so you're going to notice that compared to the BMW, where this car definitely...
You mean Toyota?
I'm sorry. The Toyota is definitely more sorted in terms of suspension damping on the street, and the main thing is there's far more NVH and there's way more road noise in this compared to the Supra on the street.
What's more fun though on the street?
To me, the manual the manual Z. I just feel like it's a great combination of new school turbocharged engine that has a ton of horsepower. It's got a decent manual transmission. Because there's less NVH.
Apparently, someone's going to think that was me.
No, it wasn't you.
All these black marks in the road.
No, this time it wasn't you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. What were you saying?
No, I just feel like this is the best combination of modern sports car with older school sports car, where you still feel something. You feel like you're connected to the car. You feel like you're doing something. And to me, that's the big selling point of the Z.
Look, I agree with you. I think on the street, because there's a little bit more connection, because there's more glass, I don't feel like I'm in a deep, dark hole, as you talked about in the interior segment. I think the Z is the more enjoyable, but less competent street car. So Mark, we're at Autobahn Country Club and the all-new Z. This one has a manual transmission and is on RE71 RSs. So, what do you think?
I really love driving this car, Jack. I drove this and the Supra back-to-back on the same tires. And yes, the Supra is going to be faster, and if you're looking at absolute lap times, it's going to have a higher overhead, I think, initially. But this car feels way more connected, and I'll tell you why. Despite the ass end being way too soft in here, the back just floats around too much. This car feels way more connected to me, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the way the steering angle is set up, where I turn and the car reacts one-to-one with what I'm doing. There's not this enormous feel that I'm riding on top of the car like the Supra is. I can get on this, turn the wheel, the car reacts organically front to back, whereas the Supra's like, you turn the wheel a quarter inch and the car's snapping. It's constantly upsetting the car, so it takes so much time to get adjusted to it. So this is the car that I would much rather drive day to day. I think it's going to be more fun on the street. It's more approachable, and it's just more organic, more of a driver's car.
And this is where I'm going to disagree with you, Mark, because, see, I drove this originally in our original video, and on the stock tires, on that particular track where you are not going or carrying anywhere as much speed as you are here, really loading up the suspension, this car is just so unbelievably soft. I feel like I'm on a goddamn waterbed.
Yeah, but you know what, though? It's not just about that. It's about the overall, like, how do I put this? It's about the way that the car is connected front to rear, the way that it transitions. The BMW or the Supra is just trying to be artificially or synthetically like quick. They wanted all the responses to feel quick, like to give you the impression it was such an agile car, but you don't feel anything through your seat. You feel like you're along for the ride, and yes, it's going fast, but you're not feeling like the car.
You can feel the front of this car load up because it is double wishbone. The front and the rear may talk to one another better, but stock today, in this car, when you're about to get on the brakes at over 100 miles an hour, it starts to swirl around on you. There's all this weight transfer. As you get the car to turn on in, the car is heaving this way, and then you have the secondary body motions associated with the car.
Yeah,
I think that's my problem with it.
It is a street car, Jack, and I can guarantee you that if you had a stiffer suspension, 90% of that would go away. And the drivability factor, much like we got out of the NSX, for example, where you felt like you were a part of driving the car, that's what this car does great, that the Supra does not. The Supra is just like, oh, look how quick, and oh, I can snap it and make the tail go back with the throttle. That BMW shit that I absolutely loathe is not here in this car. And that's why I think it's better, even though it's not as fast.
Well, Mark, let's find out. Let's hop into the Supra so I can show you what a real man does.
All right, let's do it.
Oh, Mark, listen to that fake, sweet engine noise, Mark. Ooh. B58, ZF8 speed, RE71 RSs, Mark.
Yeah, these tires are incredible, man. They feel like a baseline R-Comp, like a really nerfed like Hoosier. It's amazing. So tell me why you like this car.
Well, Mark, I hate to be this guy because I have this love-hate relationship with this car, but I like the fact that it feels really nimble. I can do that in this car. I like the fact that it feels constantly like you're at the limit of grip when you're pushing it. I like the fact that there's always the suggestion that the rear end's gonna come around. I like the edginess. No, it's not natural. No, it's not organic. Yes, it feels like an over-caffeinated child. It feels like you're driving a video game. But when you're chasing that speed, it's a pretty good car, particularly for 55 grand, Mark.
I think that's the main thing. You know, like if you put it in perspective of what you're getting here for the price, like BMW performance is incredible. The engine and transmission are really amazing, and they're far superior in terms of performance in my perspective than the Z, and that's about the only thing I will say.
This is a car that I think with the inputs, it's hard to be smooth. You know, in some ways I like that. It definitely exacerbates some of my issues as a driver, right? Because I'm chopping at the wheel.
Yeah.
But corner out, I think this car puts down power way better than the
corner exit. This
yes.
car's better. Corner entry, it's far worse. And the thing for me is what is it as a street car? And I think they both have their strong suits. I think the Z is far more approachable. It's far more natural. It feels like that older sports car.
If you are that type A person and you're buying a car to go fast with, do you think that $4,000 or $5,000 price delta between the Z and the Supra can be made up in time, right? If you have $4 or $5 grand to spend on the Z, do you think you can make it better to drive, or at least faster?
I think it's already better to drive.
All right, but do you think you can make it faster?
I don't think you can make it faster, even with a really good set of coilovers, tuning, and all that. I think this will always have a higher overhead. But I think the Z, when you get it on dampers and brakes, it's going to feel like a real driver's car, like really connected, where you're doing the work. This car will always feel like it's doing all the work for you, and that's my takeaway of it.
All right, Mark, so with that then, let's head into the final thoughts, sir.
All right. Final thoughts. Oh, you wanted to say it?
No, I'll say it first. I'll say huge thanks to all those involved. This video was not easy to make, and there were a lot of moving parts. So huge thanks to our reps at Toyota, Jen and Paul, our reps at Nissan, Dan, Passe, Jonathan, and Wendy, our friends at Bridgestone who provided us the RE71 RS, huge thanks to Brad Davies, the guys at AFA Performance. If you are here in the Midwest looking to get some tires mounted, go to them, or other performance parts installed. AMS for dynoing the car and giving us some time with their calibration engineer, Miles, who walked us through the pros and cons of the engines, and Autobahn Country Club, where we did all of our track driving, and they gave us this guy, Britt Casey, who's an IMSA driver. He raced in TCR and GT4, and he's a much better driver than Mark and I. So let's talk.
No, actually, if you combine our talents, we equal one of him.
So with that in mind, let's talk about the lap times first. The Z was essentially 2 seconds a lap slower than the Supra. So Britt, how do they handle? How do they drive on track?
Yep, so right off the bat, you could tell the difference in roll stiffness between the two was pretty significant. The Nissan Z had a lot more roll to it in the body on initial turn-in, kind of leaned over more in the corner in total. You know, call max steering angle of the corner. The car is much more leaned over in the Nissan than the Supra. I think it favors the Supra being stiffer that way. Debatable on whether that's better for daily driving. However, I thought the car in the Supra was more capable on a racetrack in terms of speed and also in terms of mid-corner grip. So both a horsepower thing and a handling thing. However, I thought the brakes were pretty similar. Both of them I thought were pretty much the same exact feel, same exact type of fade, pretty classic for a street car on a racetrack type of brake pedal feel. The gearbox in the Nissan was really nice. I thought it was really positive the way it shifted. Never missed a shift or anything like that. One thing about the braking I would say was different about the Nissan is when you slam the brakes on your initial brake application, the rear really comes up, like the weight shifts forward, the nose slams down, and the rear kind of extends upward, almost like it's sitting all on the front tires. So under full threshold brake, which is max pressure braking, the rear in the Nissan was a little more active, so you could definitely see my hands a little more not twitchy, but more like making minute adjustments in the brake zone, just because the car is a little less stable driving in a straight line while you're on the brake pedal. On the other hand, the Supra was super locked down. Both of the cars braked around the same point. I think the Supra was carrying a little bit more speed, but that says something for the Supra as well. I think the difference was 2 seconds, but it's not necessarily black and white. I think both are really good for the racetrack. And debatably, I'd say the Nissan gives you more of a driver feel. Both cars are great, but they definitely drive different.
So the Supra, and I'll start with this one first. The Supra is clearly the more, let's call it, sophisticated car. You look at the chassis, CLAR is clearly a more expensive platform than what the Nissan's on. The B58 is a highly underrated motor when it comes to power figures. They claim 382 and like 360 foot-pounds of torque at the crank. As you saw, it's more like 404 and 421. It is a much more powerful car. It's a faster vehicle on the track, and it rides better, and it's quieter than the Z. I'm not saying it's the better car, because it is kind of like an over-caffeinated car when you drive it. You don't feel a whole lot. But if you are chasing speed, you want to go faster around the racetrack, you want to go faster in a straight line, and you want to build a huge horsepower car very easily, the Supra is probably what you're going to go with. But Mark, tell me about the Z.
Okay, you're waiting for it, right? So the thing is that we're talking about pure numbers, and we're talking about kind of track performance, which is not where we actually live. And I'm not going to make an excuse. The Nissan Z and the engine and transmission performance, at least on the automatic, is inferior to the Supra. The closed deck of the B58, you see the tuning capability of it. It's much higher out of the box, and it's been very proven. However, here's the thing. When I drove those cars back to back, and we drive a lot of cars, the Nissan feels more old school. It has that analog feel, more driver's car feel. It doesn't feel like every single input has been over-exaggerated, from steering to throttle response to the twitchiness of the car, and therefore, when I was driving the Z on track, it's still fast. We're talking about the horsepower numbers very similar, you're off about 20, where the big difference was the torque. And that's where you saw in our pseudo drag race, the Supra won every time, but that's because it has so much more torque off the line.
And it's lighter.
And it's lighter, so it has that just baked in advantage. But what I got is I always felt like the Supra was going in a different direction. Like the front and the rear end don't particularly talk to each other that well. You get in the straights and you constantly feel like you're riding on top of this car. Even though it's stiffer, even though it has better body control, there's less connectivity going from the front end through the driver to the back, and it takes some time to get adjusted to it. And while it's faster, it doesn't feel better to drive to me. I would take the Nissan almost 10 out of 10 times, not only for street driving, but for track driving. Also because I can roll down the windows on the Nissan and not have my eardrums blown out from wind buffeting. So there's a lot of like real world factors that the Nissan does better. Like you're living on the street, and yes, it's not as quiet, but it's a sports car, it's a GT car. And I think all it's missing is just a little bit of brake work. And of course, if you're track driving it, you need some suspension work on the Z, because it's more set up as a GT.
And to deal with the fueling problems. So something we found out during this as well, the Z is one of the few cars I've ever driven where if it has less than 3/4 of a tank, even on street
like a half
tires,
a tank is basically the threshold.
It'll fuel cut because all of the fuel will slosh either left or right. And
there's only one pickup point in the tank, and it's very similar to the Red Sport. The Red Sport has the same problem. So if you're drag racing it or you're on track, you have to keep it above 50% fuel all times, and that's a real problem. If you're running a 20-minute session, you could blow through a half tank pretty easily if you're adept or on a bigger track.
The last point to bring up, and I know we kind of alluded to it in this video, is the GR86. So when Britt ran the GR86, it ran a 1:38.9, and you can see it on this lap time figure, which is only 2 seconds is a big deal, but it's only 2 seconds lap slower than you in the Z, and it's 4 seconds lap slower than you in the Supra. But that car is $20,000 less essentially, than the Z and the Supra. Our car that we've been testing so far is basically mostly stock. It's on an Apex wheel and a wider tire, and it's really, really close. Britt, I know you didn't really talk about it, but how does that car feel compared to these other two vehicles?
So that car is obviously lighter than all of them, I think. I think it, from a driver feel perspective, I don't know the exact numbers of what the exact mass
It's
of the car is.
2,800
Pounds, yeah,
yeah,
so it's substantial.
yeah, it's thousands, or not thousands.
He's bad at math. It's like 600-700 pounds lighter. Yeah.
So I would say it's lighter for sure. What that means is the car reacts faster to direction changes. It's easier to slow down with smaller brakes. I liked the gearbox in that one. However, I also really liked how much speed you could roll through the corner, even before we added the bigger tire and the better brakes, brake fluid and pad. That was all we did. Mid-corner speed, I thought the car turned in with I had a more confident attitude driving it. I felt like it was doing a lot more things that were intuitive to me than both the Z and the Supra. I would say it's more of a direct feel of the racetrack type of driving car rather than the Supra and the Z. They have some other added benefits to them which the GR86 doesn't have.
I think it's safe to say.
But the Supra and the Z are like twice as fast as that car in a straight line. I mean, it's like you're going to leave the 86 like, trying to figure out how to tie its shoes. I mean, there's no comparison in terms of speed. I mean, the lap times are, again, you could argue that it is the GR86 is a much more like driver's car feel, for sure.
For sure, yeah.
But I think
that one also has bad window buffering, by the way.
Yeah, it does.
Buffeting, sorry.
I think that the one thing I will say as we were wrapping this out, because I saw this a lot on the internet, it's like, could you make a GR86 faster than the Supra? Unless you are cracking open the motor and putting a turbo on it, that ain't happening. Or gutting the car.
It's not worth it.
Yeah, you're just going to ruin the car.
You're doing an engine swap at that point. I mean, the Supra and the Z, their engines are so powerful. They are, and it's funny because we say this in a lot of our videos, how fast modern cars have gotten. Like, we were joking around about this Supra that sold for, what was it?
$220,000.
Yeah, the old Supra. I mean, that thing, like, compared to these cars, stock versus stock, I mean, there's no comparison with how fast these cars are. So we're just dissecting what's good for a different type of person. If all you want to do is go fast in a straight line and like make massive numbers, the Supra is amazing. If you want the driver's car feel, you want more of a connected old school feel, I feel like the Z is a better street car for usability, better feel. And then the 86 is the budget driver's car. It really is.
So with that said, thanks for watching and thanks for sitting through this very, very long video.